Yeah.
Is she with you?
NMDA receptor.
She's probably getting some type of like coffee or something.
Yeah, Carola's just here.
Oh, she was just here.
And
She's.
you-
I
you
think
would
she's
pick-
been something from me. Did she go get together?
Guys, let's actually move around a bit so that everyone can sit like at the table, not like in the second row.
She had to
So
go upstairs.
maybe when Carol comes, you can like slide over.
Yeah.
I saw her. She did
No,
not
no.
come with us. I saw her. I think on that one picture near
Should
Kathy's
we all
office.
move up, or should we just?
I think as long as she's happy to steal that seat, we should be good.
Okay. So we'll start properly in a minute when Carol's here. So have you guys all met? So I'm about to ask two probably redundant questions. One is completely redundant, I think, and the other one is maybe less so. So I think you've all met Brad, right? Is that a true statement?
That's true.
Okay. Okay. And have you all met Mike, also known as Mike Tannenhouse? Have you all met
Mike
him?
T. Sometimes he's referred to him.
Have because it's not that unlikely that some of you may not have met. Why don't those of you who have not met him just briefly say hi? Hey Carol, we just move things around a little bit just so you can sit at the table too, because let's make some space so Shredder and let's make some space so everyone can sit at the table. I think there's enough space. Let's because otherwise it's like this kind of second idea.
Thank you, though.
Yeah, there's actually a spare seat here. I can move around a little bit. Because especially for like discussion groups. Oh no, okay, that's fine.
It's gonna be not.
No. Hey, why yeah.
The camera's just gonna be my reactions to the entire.
That would actually, there's probably like a whole genre of videos that are like that.
Yeah, tell me.
You are
Why
taking
don't you sit in this seat?
Is that okay? Still.
No, it's mostly actually the computer. You're fine though. I mean, all the screen is visible.
Okay, well we could, I'll tell you what, as long as everyone comes in a little bit when we do the more discussion-y bit, how's that? Does that sound good? Is that little red dot thing flashing on the...
Yeah.
It's just constant.
Yep, you're recording.
Yeah.
It's so hard to tell with these things.
Yeah, it's located in two. Yeah, you're recording. It's been 2 minutes thus far.
Oh yeah, okay. Okay. So anyway, so anyone who hasn't met Mike Tannenhouse, we're very lucky to have him here today because he knows much more about language than I or almost anyone else in the department will ever know. And if you ever want to know anything about language, he would be a very, very good person to talk to. And that includes me. There's so many conversations I would like to have with you, Mike, which I should make a time to make. Which is, but anyway, that will happen.
Thank you.
Over time. But
you have to be pre-warned that I tell people more than I know.
there's, you know how like there's sort of an inverse function between, depth of knowledge and degree of like bragging about it. Yeah. So that was an illustration right there. As for me, I know everything. Okay. So. Now, this is going to be way too introductory for some of you and probably not introductory enough for others. And I think it's quite, which is actually a nice thing. Let's make some space so that everyone can sit around the table. I know it's getting just a teensy bit. Can you guys kind of squid you a little bit at the end so Dennis can come too? Awesome. Hey Dennis, welcome back from your trip. So, those of you, let me see, I think there's probably at least maybe 3 or 4 people who sort of do stuff to do with language. Can those of you who do stuff to do with language, more than 3 or 4 actually, just kind of very briefly just say just a couple of words about what you're interested in? Is this okay, me kind of putting you on the spot a bit? Because I think it's very nice, there's a mixture of people who do more languagey stuff and more neuroscience-y stuff and more computationally stuff and all kinds of things. And we can all, especially in the discussion bit, we can all learn from each other and that would be great. So today might be an opportunity for us to pick the brains of some of the languagey people a little bit. And also, and I would be particularly welcome this, for languagey people to say, I bet, you don't have to say this, but I wouldn't be entirely at all surprised if you're thinking it, and if you are, please think it out loud. Yeah, I guess brain stuff is probably kind of interesting, but I've really never seen anything to do with language in the brain that actually talks to any of the questions that I actually, as a language person, care about. So, hey brain people, how about thinking about some of those questions? If it's even possible, let's see if it is possible. And that would be an entirely legitimate thing to say, and in fact actually very stimulating. But you don't have to say it right now, or you can if you want, but that might be an interesting thing for discussion potentially. So anyway, but literally just say a couple of words if you do anything about language, if that's okay. You don't have to.
Cool. Hi, I'm Frank. I do, my interests are basically in semantic memory, semantic representation, how adults learn new words, how children acquire compositional semantics, or how they put together meaning. So that's basically the kind of background that I have in language.
Great, thanks.
Hey everyone, I'm Amanda. I study, I guess, pragmatics, basically how people learn to use language in an intentional manner, or how to interpret how someone uses an intentional set of language, so how they imply more than what they explicitly say, how we adapt to how people use this style of language, how we adapt to different speakers and how they use language this way, and how kids learn how to use it, understand it, and also adapt to different speakers.
Great, thank you. Now, I'm just guessing completely without basis that both of you probably have never actually seen, probably because one doesn't exist, which might be nice to make one, a study which sort of says anything even in the tiniest bit interesting about what might be happening in the brain while these, what information processing, what representations, not that, you know, some language area lights up or something, but something that actually informs your understanding of these topics. Is that a reasonable guess? It's suggesting maybe that this is like territory to be explored potentially by us.
Are you talking to all?
Yeah, I will. Yes, yes. Well, we'll get to everyone saying their language of it, but yeah, you know, yeah, to everyone.
Cymatics and prosody, I haven't seen much of stuff.
Okay, well that sounds very plausible. Yeah.
It's like time course stuff, but that's not really, as I mentioned once before, like much more informative than what we have in eye tracking thus far.
Okay, well that's very interesting too. So this is great. This is setting challenges for, like, you know, what ought a cognitive neuroscience of language to look like if it actually listened more to what people who actually know something about language, you know, cared about. We collectively can actually maybe even make that happen. So this is not just an idle speculation. Hopefully, it won't be easy. I'm sure. Okay, where are we at? Mariam, why did you say something about?
I do the influence of social or top-down linguistic information on how bottom-up linguistic information is processed. It's still part of what I've got. So, and generalizations about how different groups of people. It was very similar to what Dave was talking about today. If you liked.
Great. Who caught Dave's talk? Many of you? Awesome. Okay, so there was a nice example of language stuff. And Dave and Florian and I are actually right now trying to sort of bang our heads against this problem of, can we actually come up with an neuroscientific study that actually does say something interesting about the kinds of questions that Dave was talking about? And it's not an easy problem, but it's, we think we might be able to do something, but we'll see. Zach, why didn't you say so?
So I'm kind of similar to what she's doing. So I'm interested in kind of like generalizations and about people make about speakers or a group of speakers, but kind of looking at more like adaptation and alignment, and maybe like a little bit of metrics or something.
Okay, that's great. This I'm about to betray my own ignorance, but I think I may not be the only person feeling this ignorance. So this is a true statement about people in the world in general. So well, it's certainly true about me. I find it much easier to understand specific examples than sort of general statements. So I can understand. So now I happen to sort of know a specific example of what Mariam says, but you feel free to tell us in a second. And also, I, in a very vague sense, know what like alignment and stuff might mean. But if you just give us an example of like an utterance or something, it will become about 1,000 times clearer for everyone.
Oh yeah. So I was actually, as people were saying that and giving examples, I was wondering if I should give an example too. And
Always good to give an example.
Yeah.
If in doubt, give an example.
So for alignment, it's when you're talking to somebody else, and for whatever reason, when people normally have discussions or dialogues, they're like phonetic categories and like how they use syntax kind of grows closer to each other. So you kind of, it's almost like you're getting both on the same page.
Can you give me an example of an actual stream of words that might come out of an actual person's mouth?
Like, what do you mean?
Like someone might say, "Hey there, how you doing?" and someone else might say, "Hey, I'm doing fine." That actually probably isn't an example, but
yeah,
you know what I'm saying?
Phonetically, like, have you ever noticed when you're talking to someone with a different accent that you start sounding like them?
That's a wonderful example. Thank you. This is the level of concreteness that I'm talking about. And just in general, this will be true actually. I'm sort of blurring between the lecture part and the discussion part, but that's okay. It won't make a very nice video, but who cares? This in general also will be very, very, I hope, helpful when you're sort of like writing a paper or writing a project. I can't tell you how many times I've read something where someone says, you know, I study learning and how people can learn in new situations and exploit information to learn in new situations. And I'm like, what kind of information? What kind of a new situation? What are they learning? Please just tell me one concrete thing that they're learning. And then they'll say, oh, you know, learning of a syntactic regularity. And I'm like, no, I just want to hear, like, what's the person in the room actually saying? Do you see what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. And that's mostly just because I don't know enough about what they're talking about, but it's also just because I'm sort of a human being, and human beings like that kind of thing. Yeah. So that example that Mariam just gave of, you know, you're talking to someone and you start to sound like them in their accent, that was nice. Mm-hmm. But you two don't study exactly the same thing, right?
Not exactly. So I'm also, are you looking at adaptation? Yeah, there's like, I don't know. But well, so I'm also doing like, that's alignment, and I think really maybe to do alignment you have to adapt. But like an example, a concrete example of adaptation is there was some study where there was a speaker who always used something called like high attachment. So they would say something like the uncle of the girl who drives the motorcycle. Uh-huh. And so that's ambiguous whether the girl is the one driving the motorcycle or the male is, or the uncle. But I mean, contextually, you might think the uncle's more likely to drive a motorcycle.
Okay. That's a wonderful example, and I suggest, sorry, I know I'm talking more too, but this is true for everyone. I suggest if you ever explain your work to anybody ever, use that example in the first sentence that you say, rather than like 15 sentences. So you say, and this is not specific to you, this is just in general, because I had actually no clue what you were talking about until you gave me that example. I don't know if that's helpful. So sorry, I didn't mean to sound like that probably sound like I'm picking on. I'm trying to make a general comment. Sorry. Who next works on language? I believe you work on language, I think, Mike. Is that true?
Well, I'll answer you first. So I know of two studies that to my mind, changed how I think, or strongly influenced how I think about issues in language. One was a MEG study in which people read words, one word at a time, and they were words that would set up, let's say, a context in which one would strongly expect to see a noun. And if it turned out that people got a noun, but in one case they would get a noun that looked like other nouns, in the sense that if you constructed some orthographic phonological space and put all nouns into it, this one would be very noun-like, like marble would be a case, and then compared to something that is very neutral or even looks more like a verb, and that would be something like insect, which is semantically a noun, but it sort of has this sequence of, if you put it in some, again, orthographic phonological space, it would overlap more with verbs, and you would see a very early, I think it was M110 or something like that, response if you were seeing something that was more verb-like, a noun that was more verb-like compared to a noun.
Who was this? Was this like Morten Christensen or someone like this?
He was a co-author on a PNAS paper that was a reading paper, but then this was done as a MEG study by the Pilkington Group and Thomas Farmer, who was here.
Okay. Oh, okay.
And the first
Interesting.
author is Suzanne Dicker.
Okay.
And then a related study that is in the press was done by the first author is Chris Boylan, who was at Penn. And
Say the name again.
Chris
Boyd?
Boylan, B-O-Y-L-A-N, along with John Cruisewell and Sharon Thompson Schill.
Okay.
Is a related thing. What they do is set up a context where, say, you would either expect a noun or expect a verb, and then they look to see in the visual word form area to see whether you could do a pattern pattern recognizer on what activity in that area and predict whether you were in a noun context or a verb context.
Oh, wow, interesting.
Before you get the actual word, and they found that you could separate what would be expected noun versus
Very interesting.
expected.
Oh man, I'd love to chat more with you about those.
Yeah, and those are interesting because they suggest that high-level expectations about things like grammatical class could actually filter down in terms of expectations you had about what the signal might be like, so that you're farming it out to the
That's super
sensory
interesting.
end, and that bears on the kind of question that, say, people in language processing debate over.
That's exactly the kind of thing, but in a slightly different domain that me and Dave and Florian are trying to cook up right now. So, okay, I would love to chat more with you about that. That is, we're probably not going to get in, today to, we're definitely not going to get today to things that, Mike is clearly too modest to actually told you anything about himself. All I'm just going to say is go to Google Scholar and look him up and sort by time cited, and then you'll know, okay? Who else does languagey type stuff? You do something related to language,
yeah.
right?
Well, so yeah, I do languagey things, and I think my most immediate direction will not be super languagey, but in the past, so one of the languagey things that I've worked on is using the visual world paradigm to look at basically covert activation of a second language in bilinguals during an English mode setting. So basically, I guess, I don't know.
No, that's helpful. That's
okay,
great.
I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that's wonderful. I just can't allow the phrase visual world paradigm to be uttered in this room without just providing a bit more context about that.
Okay.
So.
Yeah. So. So basically, for the study, you see 4 different pictures. And the idea is that, when you hear a word, you're supposed to associate the word to the image that best fits this word. And so what we did was we manipulated the voice onset time of some of the words, and we also used different lexical statuses, so cognates and non-cognates, and then English VOT and Spanish VOT to see if you could get. So basically, if highly proficient bilinguals could use very specific representations of these words in Spanish, for instance, and have that boost their activation towards an image that had a similar onset to the target word in English.
Okay.
So it's called an interlingual competitor.
Okay.
Basically, they can
interesting.
yeah.
Very interesting. I don't know how to ask this question without risking being slightly obnoxious, but hopefully in a good cause. Do you happen to know who came up with the visual world paradigm?
Yeah.
Okay, and because not everyone in the room actually knows that. I'm sorry if I'm just being annoying. I don't know, but people need to know this stuff. That's what I'm saying. Okay. Okay, Mike Tannhaus came up with the visual. So the thing is, I know it's. I'm sorry. I just sound like I'm hey everyone look but this is actually relevant because. We're in a department, we're very lucky to be in a department where if you're interested in something, you can literally walk down the corridor and ask someone who, if they didn't invent it, knows an awful lot about it. And if you spend time in this department and you don't make those walks down the corridor, then you're totally underutilizing this department, is what I'm saying. And the thing is, there's no way in advance that you would actually know that such a walk in the corridor would hit such a good target until you've already made the walk. So that's why I'm trying to kind of actively encourage. Yesterday, day before yesterday, in the recent past, I was giving a guest lecture, and Florian, if you haven't met Florian Jäger, he's another person who, if you're interested in language, you should really meet. He's teaching an undergrad class in language. And one of the undergrads came up to me at the end and said, "Oh yeah, I'm really interested in kind of language development in kids, in babies, and like how that happens." And I said, "Oh well, if you're interested in that, you should really talk to Dick Aslan." And she's like, "Who's Dick Aslan?" And then I said, "Well, he's this person, and he works in this stuff." And there's no, in a perfect world, the undergrad would have known who Dick Aslan was, and that she was just down the corridor from him. But it's not a perfect world, and so she didn't know that. Now she does, and that's hopefully, I don't know what will come from that, so there's great resources, and you have to go and make these walks down the corridor. I need to make more of these walks down the corridor. I really do. Okay, but do that anyway. Okay. That's enough of me yabbering. So I apologize. That probably came across as annoying. Anyway, okay. So language areas in the brain. What is the point of studying language? And I think this is what is the point of studying the brain with respect to language? There's clearly a point to studying language. Language is one of the most important aspects of our lives. We'd all be in terrible trouble if we didn't have language. Okay. Why bother with anything brain-related for language? Well, you might say, well, this is a cognitive neuroscience class. Of course, we're going to talk about brain stuff for language. But I mean this is a completely serious question. Okay, it's really a true statement, and I think that this was probably illustrated a little bit. Thank you everyone for the little kind of thumbnail sketches of what you do. People do really, really, really interesting studies of language without ever having to stick anyone's head in a brain scanner or strap some EEG cap onto them, or You might want to get some measures of things that are not kind of overtly very easy to get, like eye tracking or measuring reaction times or doing some clever design. But people discover amazing, wonderful things about language without any brain stuff coming in. And there's a real risk of I'll show you some examples of which I hope you'll think go beyond this. But there's a real risk that brain stuff will just say, yeah, we understood some major thing now because we know that this bit at the front left of their head lights up, or this bit here lights up. And, that is maybe important information to know. It certainly tells you where to look next. It's certainly clinically important. If you hear that someone got a brain injury, you certainly want to know if it was on the left side of their head or not, for like what kind of problems they're likely to experience. But it doesn't in and of itself tell you anything really about, what's actually functioning here, like what are the representations, what's the information processing. Like for instance, I might say to you, I'm very interested in speech, and I now actually understand the physiological basis of speech. And you're like, oh really, that's great, what is it? Yeah, people use their mouths. It turns out that, so now we know. Well, that's a true statement, and in fact, if you want to know more about how speech is made, looking at people's mouths and their tongues and their lips and their vocal cords and their teeth is going to be a very good place to start. But we know that people use their mouth. It doesn't tell you huge. It tells you something. It doesn't tell you much. Okay, so we want to be careful that if we're studying language in the brain, that we don't end up with some statements that are more or less along the lines of people talk with their mouths. Okay? Even though that we're probably going to pass through that on the way. So what are some language areas in the brain? Well, there's two. This next bit is going to be very introductory, but I'm going to just go through it quickly. There's two kind of important, especially important areas, which we'll soon see are not nearly the beginning or the end of the story. Well, the beginning of the story, not the end of the story. So there's Broca's area and Wernicke's area. I'm guessing that most of you probably already heard of those. Don't, if you haven't, that's completely fine. That's part of the purpose of this class. And also, again, this is probably something that most of you already know, the fact that these areas are mostly on the left. A little bit less often in left-handed, but even in left-handed people. So for instance, I'm left-handed, and I happen to know that my language areas are more on the left because I've been scanned. That's more or less the only left brain, right thing that you'll ever hear, which is actually true. All the other stuff, like right brain's more creative, blah, 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 is not really true. And was actually, people cooked that stuff up way before anyone actually was able to look at someone's left or right brain actually doing creative stuff. Now, one of the things we talked a bit about last week was this, and you sort of noticed in this kind of conflict between the two readings last week, that there was one paper that said, yeah, when people say there's like these specialized modules in the brain, don't believe them. And there was another paper that said, does specialized modules in the brain? Okay? And I happen to have more sympathy for one side than the other, but that's just me. There's a large range of opinion on that. And language is one of these questions. And here there's questions about that, not just in terms of are there particular areas in the brain, but all this kind of more abstract sense of a module of, is there something which may not be sitting in one particular location, but is like a sort of functional module, whatever that means. There's this special sort of faculty of language which is kind of its own thing, and that idea, even if it's distributed, a little bit like saying there's the immune system, right? The immune system's everywhere within us, but it is kind of a thing in a certain sense. And this idea that language is sort of like its own special thing, or maybe it's not its own special thing, is also very, very hotly debated there, and in fact a lot of research, including research that gets done on this department, in many ways plugs into that debate. Okay, so, and that debate is not exactly the same as the one of are there specialized language areas, but it's kind of in the same ballpark. So, so just quickly, because this is probably familiar, but the Broca's area is very important for speech perception, but it's really important for lots of other stuff too. Okay? But it was first discovered, the most overt. So one day there's this French neurologist, Paul Broca, and some patient walks into his office, and the poor guy can only say 10. And somewhat uncharitably, this means that like his friends, or not friends but associates, nicknamed him Tan. That guy's called Tan. All he can say is Tan. Okay. What's particularly unfortunate about that is Tan could understand what they were saying. Right? He knew they were making fun of him. He just couldn't say anything about it. Okay. So he had comprehension, but his production was impaired. Okay. Now, in fact, if you were to do lots, you can't now. And this is actually his brain. Okay. So post-mortem, Broca got to kind of look at his brain, and there was this big chunk missing from it. But if you were to do actually more subtle tests on this person than just can you speak or not, you'd actually find all kinds of other deficits too. But the most overt, most noticeable one is the guy can't speak very well. Well, he can speak, but very haltingly, and can only say like 1 or 2 words. Okay. And then sort of the converse of that is Wernicke's area, which if you lose that, you have the opposite problem. You can speak a lot, but what you say doesn't make any sense. So you have problems in comprehension, but not in production. And so this is called Wernicke's area. It's also mostly on the left. It's a little bit further back. It's sort of around here, kind of just behind auditory cortex. Again, it's a complete oversimplification to say that, Wernicke's area is like the area that does speech comprehension, or the thing that happens in Wernicke's area is speech comprehension. But it's also true that if you knock out Wernicke's area, the most overt and noticeable thing is that someone will just start to kind of speak gibberish and not necessarily even realize that they're speaking gibberish. And so this is kind of where Wernicke's area is. It's like this pink thing, and you see it's a kind of extended location. It's not even, people debate a bit about, exactly where does it start and stop, but let's just say that in general it's probably around here-ish. The blue thing is like primary auditory cortex. That's responsible much more for listening to this kind of processing sort of raw sounds, like, the waveform that's hitting your eardrum. And here's just a little sort of movie of like what those look like, just because, it's kind of, this nice thing about this movie also shows that there's connections between these areas, and these connections are important as well. And you remember that Mike and I would, we should really devote, maybe we will, the whole class to these very, very interesting things that I'm saying about how there's kind of different types of information being passed between there's like higher level linguistic information, like you expect that something's going to look sort of noun-like, and there's lower level information of, what are the letters that are hitting my eyeballs right now? What are the vibrations that are hitting my eardrums right now? And all of these different types of information are somehow impacting upon each other and somehow communicating with each other in ways that are very poorly understood. And it's a reasonable statement to say that lots of the most interesting questions are trying to figure out, behaviorally, computationally, and neurally, trying to figure out what is going on with all these different types of information, high-level information, low-level information, all talking to each other. Lots of interesting questions there. And in fact, that was kind of what Dave Fleischman's talk was about, for those of you who went to that. So anyway, so there are actually, connections literally between these areas. So that's a candidate pathway for some of that stuff. And it still doesn't tell you anything about what the actual information is or how it's being sent or what's being done with it. But let's, he says here's a roadway that maybe something's going along there. But there's much more to language in the brain than Broca's and Winnicott. So this is a picture from one of the readings. So, by the way, I mostly, as you probably noticed, I've mostly been setting like trends in cognitive sciences readings, and you may not appreciate this until you start reading a lot of papers from journals that are not trends in cognitive sciences, but trends in cognitive sciences are like really friendly, useful, compact, nice. Like you won't get nicer nuggets of information than you find in that journal in the whole. Even if it didn't seem like it at the time, that's kind of about as good as it gets. There's another one, Current Opinion in Neurobiology, but that's more neuroscience-y in focus in general. Although actually it turns out that the very latest issue actually has some stuff on language. Anyway, so here here we're seeing these, there's these connections between these areas. Well, here's a sort of little cartoon by Angela Friederici, I may not be pronouncing that right, literally showing, well, these are meant to illustrate physical connections and also directions of information flow. And in fact, she talks quite a lot in that article about kind of top-down expectations having influence on lower-level processing and the effect of ambiguity at the lower level on stuff that's happening higher up. So it's reasonable to say that these sort of more frontal Broca's type areas are probably dealing with higher level, more languagey type things than these lower level, especially certainly primary auditory cortex and probably surrounding areas are dealing more with the sound as like an auditory waveform. But there's no clean barrier there, because look at all these connections between them, and in fact you'll find evidence of higher level processing in these so-called lower level areas, and you'll find evidence of acoustic factors influencing what's going on up here as well. And so notice also that as well as his Broca's and Wernicke's, so his Broca's, his Wernicke's here, there's also all this stuff like going along the whole of the temporal cortex, middle temporal, so there's lots of areas. And this is not even at all a complete set of areas involved in the brain, in language, at all. Okay? So for instance, the claim that language is on the left is also a total oversimplification. So here's from, this wasn't one of the readings, but it's kind of a nice picture that, so here's the left side of the brain, which we've been looking at so far, but look, here's the right-hand side of the brain, there's all kinds of stuff here as well. So there's this, in this paper, Carsten Speck sort of lays out this gradient from sort of stuff that's really on one side, stuff that's really on the left to stuff that's more or less bilateral. And it's not unfair to say that the lower level stuff tends to be more on both sides, and as you get to higher level stuff, it tends to be more on the left. But you can see that there's a lot of things happening in both hemispheres here. So even the statement "language is on the left," although it's like a true statement, it's true in the same way as saying the economy of the United States is in Wall Street is a true statement. Right? It's true, but it leaves out a lot. Okay? So here's another illustration, which is from this is another interesting author, Jonathan Peele, and again it just shows as you go from sort of lower level things to higher level, because the lower level is drawn at the top here and the higher level is at the bottom. But then you get more and more left stuff and a little bit more right stuff. So what I'm really trying to say here is that language is in many places in the brain, and there's many different functions, and all of these different functions influence each other. So, Dave Kleinschmidt in his talk today gave examples of if you know what the word is, it influences what you think, how you might classify what you think the phoneme is. But similarly, and Mike, for instance, has done work on this, that as you know things more about like these higher levels, it influences how you might choose from these lower levels here as well. So I'm going to show you in a minute some examples of studies of language which hopefully go a little in the brain, which hopefully go a little bit beyond just saying, yeah, people talk with their mouths, yeah, stuff happens in their Broca's or Wernicke's area. But in order to get a little bit of a feel for that, and also just to build a little bit upon, this was what more in the McGettigan and Scott reading. It's worth unpacking a little bit just what is language. In particular, I'm going to concentrate more on speech now. What is it built out of? Okay, it turns out that it's built out of more stuff than you might actually imagine. I mean, you've read the readings now, so and you probably knew a lot of this anyway. But once you get more of a picture of what it's built out of, then you can. That is an avenue to saying, okay, well, given that this interesting and intriguing stuff is in there, let's try and look at how that is represented.
Can I just say one footnote?
Yes, please.
Which is just the point that, in evaluating a claim like language lateralizations, the other issue is, okay, so here's another story. You could say, well, it's extremely rare for a right lesion to lead to noticeable aphasic problems.
Right.
You might have problems with intonation or sort of global aspects, context, that kind of stuff. But usually right lesions don't cause any real aphasia.
Right.
And yet, in language tests with fMRI, you get a lot of right hemisphere activation.
Right.
So, maybe that raises the question of, okay, why is the right hemisphere activated in this language test and fMRI? And then there's this gradient. I mean, it could be the case that it's essentially piggybacking on the left, and they're just all these transcolossal fibers, and you just have activation spreading in the system, and it's not actually telling you what's going on.
Right.
Versus, it is actually doing something, but it's kind of playing more of a supportive role. So I'm just saying that,
Yeah, no,
it also depends very much on the kinds of evidence you
Those
think
are
about.
really, no, thank you so much. Those are really, really good points. And this is, I don't want to spend the whole time just kind of like giving you all the caveats without giving you the things to have that they're caveats too. But the caveats are really important because I think that especially if you're going to kind of be thinking of interesting new studies, most of them will be in these sort of gray areas where things, you might at first sight think you know what's going on, but in fact it's a little more complicated or a little more kind of richer than you initially thought. And Brad's point is absolutely really crucial there because, just because you see some activation, I mean, I think I mentioned something about this last week, that, when you see some activation, it's not kind enough to come along with a little label attached saying, hello, I'm for this function, I'm doing this, right? All you know is there's something happening, right? But is it actually the real workhorse that, that other areas are depending upon, or are you just kind of seeing some sort of, like Brad said, just some kind of like echo of what's actually happening in some other area, right? So if I turn on my laptop and I have it on, and I have it on my legs and I start, playing like a YouTube video or something, I might feel it getting hot, right? Okay, I might feel, like the warmth on my legs, okay? And I might say, aha, my laptop is a very effective leg warmer. Clearly, I've now discovered the function of a laptop. Okay, but all I've really discovered is that there's this kind of side effect. There is something really truly going on inside the laptop that is producing heat. But if I were to get rid of the heat, if I were to stick an ice pack under my laptop, it wouldn't prevent it from playing the YouTube video. It might actually make it play better, actually. Okay, so whatever that heat is, it's certainly not essential to the process that's going on. It's just kind of some radiating thing, right? So similarly, maybe, who knows? These are really very open questions, okay? Maybe all this stuff that's happening on the right-hand side of the brain is just, laptop heat that you're catching from what's going on over here. Because if you get rid of these areas, people's language still seems reasonably okay, right? Or maybe it isn't, right? And people actually do not know the answers to these questions. Now, there's an interesting, I'm not, going to talk about this in this particular set of slides, but there's an interesting approach that people use called transcranial magnetic stimulation, which is often abbreviated as TMS. And when it is abbreviated as TMS, people rarely bother to tell you what it stands for. So then when someone next says to you TMS, it stands for transcranial magnetic stimulation, which means zapping someone's head with a magnet. Okay. You guys have done some work with that, no? No. No. Okay.
Mostly on ourselves.
Do you have a coil like down?
No.
Okay. Oh, okay.
GA does. We have one over
Okay. Duye is going to be giving Duye Tadin, who is a vision researcher and who is Michael's advisor. We're fortunate he's going to be giving a guest lecture later in the semester, and it's not like his main main thing, but one of the things that he's interested in these days is that, and maybe he'll talk about that. We'll see. But that's that one thing that's kind of one thing that's kind of interesting about that is that that's actually a way, a way with difficulties, as many of trying to get to some of these questions of, well, is this area really necessary? Because you can actually sort of temporarily knock areas out with that. You can sort of induce, they call it like reversible lesions, that literally for a few hundred milliseconds after this, some area is being zapped with this strong magnetic field, it's kind of offline for a bit. Yeah, Amanda.
Do we know if like these other areas are involved in other processes involved with language, like memory or attention or sequential processing, etc.? So like things that are used for other things also. And so there's no reason for them to be like modular with just language areas.
No, that's a very, very good question. And in fact, that question is more or less one of the central debates probably in linguistics in general, but especially in language in the brain. That's almost, it's not an exaggeration to say that's the central question. Okay, so there's people who say, no, these are really, these really are special for language, and the fact that language happens to be stuff, or spoken, the fact that speech happens to come in through your ears is not really that essential. It's like its own special thing. And there's other people who say, no, language is really just like a kind of fancy type of sound, and a fancy type of sound with some fancy statistical regularities in it, and the exact same faculties, exact same cognitive abilities that allow you to learn other types of statistical regularities are the exact same ones that in fact we're probably using for language too. So for instance, Dick Asman has done a lot of key work in that area, for instance. Yeah.
And so when we're talking about language now, are we specifically talking about speech, or are we including like written language, so reading, comprehension?
In what I'm going to talk about for the first, I'm really happy we're doing this in a more interactive way. I much prefer that than me just sort of like zapping you all with slides. So a lot of it's going to talk about speech, and I'm going to talk some about written words as well. But speech has been around with human beings for a lot longer than written words have. So written words are extremely important for us, and our brains process them in extremely interesting ways. But if you were to look at the brains of people, a few thousand years ago, well, the brains of any human beings, I don't know, like 7,000 or 8,000 years ago, and the brains of 99.9% of human beings up to like, a couple of hundred years ago, there wasn't any written language going on in there, right? So, but these people were all perfectly, or mostly perfectly fluent producers of language in speech. So it's reasonable to say that speech is more fundamentally sort of baked into the brain, but in terms of many of the really interesting and subtle and rich aspects of language, absolutely, of course, written language is where it's happening, and it's very important.
I guess I just wonder how closely tied they are. So like when we were talking about Broca's a moment ago, I wondered like whether or not Tan could write still.
That is a very, very good question. I think
still. Like,
Barry, you probably know more
language.
about this than I do, actually.
I don't know about Tan particularly, but written production and spoken production definitely dissociate very strongly sometimes. But I mean, they dissociate in opaque languages like English, and they don't dissociate so much in transparent languages. At least that's the cases of so there's some clean cases of patients who cannot write verbs but can say verbs, but only in opaque languages where you can't. So transparent meaning that the orthography and the phonology that once you know the rules of the orthography, you can figure out how it sounds, and vice versa. So once you know what a word sounds like, you can know how to spell it. And so it could be that in more, I don't know, it could be that in more transparent languages, they're able to, use alternative strategies, even if they lose one modality of output, they can.
So, but is that possibly just because, if you think about, sounding out, so if you're thinking about, sounding out the words and then writing them, right, because it's transparent, it's very different from having to memorize, 5,000 characters in, Japanese, right? So possibly, what you're doing is impacting different parts of the brain, right? Because you can piggyback off of your, if you can sound out the word, you can piggyback off of a process that you would use when you're speaking, right? But if you can't, then
I think the best guess of why these cases pop up in opaque languages and not transparent languages is that with transparent language, you know, you have the ability to, even if you lose your sort of stored representation of a word in the written modality, you can, and you still have it in the spoken modality, and you still have the orthography to phonology conversion rules of your language, you can kind of figure it out on the fly.
So wait, is an opaque language like?
I mean, English, I think, is considered, at least in the sense.
Right. Because of all the irregularity, like I thought through the cough.
So, like, you know about this, but I mean, it's not entirely opaque. It's, a lot of it's transparent, right?
Yeah.
Translucent.
It's like,
like
yeah,
that. It's like wax paper.
It's quasi-regular, so there are patterns and there's sub-patterns, but they're all, but you can't.
So you've got something like Chinese at the extreme, something like Italian at the other extreme of like nice, clean relation, and something like English in the middle.
Yeah, Chinese is even Chinese isn't totally opaque.
Okay,
It's
interesting.
part of the character that is at least probabilistically tied to how the character will be pronounced.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah, so it's one of these really vexed issues.
Okay, awesome. So, I mean, I think what I hope this is showing so far is that there's a lot of stuff going on in language, okay, which our understanding of is poor at best, and I think this suggests that there's really a lot of interesting open questions. Now, there may be open questions that are not very easy to get at, right? If they were easy to get at, they probably wouldn't be open anymore, but they're certainly out there, right? And you know, if you're interested in language and the brain, you certainly don't have to worry, no matter what I'm interested in, I bet people already understand how the brain does that. Quite the opposite, right? Well, I mean, that's true actually for many areas, but it's probably even more true for language laws. And so maybe an avenue for getting towards that is just starting to look at, well, what is some of this stuff that's in speech and language? And some of it is a little bit surprising and unexpected. So here's a little demo. This is not a neural demo as well. Just out of interest, how many of you heard sine wave speech before? Okay, so enough of you haven't heard sine wave speech that this actually might sound interesting. Okay, so I'm going to play you some sine wave speech. I'm just going to have this come out of the speaker of my laptop, but I think that'll work in this room. Okay, so here is a sound. It's going to just sound like some kind of, well, it'll sound weird. You'll hear it. I'm going to play that again. Can you I just acoustically, can you actually hear that? I know my speakers are not that loud. I probably could hook it to come out of the loudspeakers.
That doesn't work so good.
Okay, but it is a small enough room, I think.